happy to be here. Jonathan's been trying to get me to do this for a while, and I was very hesitant because I've only taught one writing class, and that was in Hawaii. And you can imagine why I said yes to that. And my friend Jackie Michard, who writes fantastic books, and you probably know her, Deep Into the Ocean and all that. So she said to me, let's team teach, because it'll be fun and it'll be easy, and you'll get to go to Hawaii. And it was a really eye-opening thing because they actually expected us to teach, so I didn't just get to go and sleep and stay on the beach all day, so that was very disappointing for me. By the end of the class, I had called someone an asshole and made another person cry. So you can understand why probably now you are very happy that I'm not teaching. And I remember after the second or third day, I said to Jackie, God, these people are writing such violent stories. And she said, you realize this is a crime writing class. So I not only was prepared, I was paying lots of attention. But it was a wonderful experience because I got to swim with the turtles. And that would be the takeaway I got from that trip. So thank you for letting me just speak. And I'm going to expect you guys to ask questions. And I would like to say thank you to the writers, not just these two, but also my friend Ella Fairburk, a tremendous writer in her own right, one of my favorite writers, for being here, and any other writers I missed. Sorry about that. I used to read from my own work, but I thought, why am I giving that away for free? So I'm going to read from a book, hopefully you guys are familiar with. It's called Gone with the Wind. So hopefully you know the basic characters, that sort of thing. Takes place in Georgia, war, we lost. That doesn't ruin the ending. But there's this scene. It's a very important scene to me. I remember reading it when I was a little girl, and I loved it because it was so violent. I know you're thinking, Gone with the Wind, violent, right? But there are very violent passages in it. So this is when Scarlett is back at Tara, the war is raged on, Tara has been decimated. Melanie, who she hates because she wants Melanie's husband, has just given birth to a child. She's very weak, and Scarlett is trying to think how she's going to get her family home back together. Her mother has just died, Ellen's just died, and she comes downstairs and she sees that there's a Yankee standing in the foyer, and he's holding her mother's sewing box. Now, when we watched the movie in Atlanta, and the Yankee appears on screen, everyone hisses, but I won't do that now. So this is what happens. So, the Yankee sees her and he says something like, all alone, little lady. Like lightning, she shoved her weapon over the banister and into the startled, bearded face. Before he could even fumble at his belt, she pulled the trigger. The back kick of the pistol made her reel as the roar of the explosion filled her ears and acrid smoke stung her nostrils. The man crashed backwards to the floor, sprawling onto the dining room with a violence that shook the furniture. The box clattered from his hand, the contents spilling about him. Hardly aware that she was moving, Scarlett ran down the stairs and stood over him, gazing down into what was left of the face above the beard, a bloody pit where the nose had been, blazing eyes burned with powder. As she looked, 2 streams of blood crept across the shining floor, one from his face and one from the back of his head. Yes, he was dead. Undoubtedly, she had killed a man. The smoke curled slowly to the ceiling, and the red streams widened about her feet. For a timeless moment, she stood there, and in the still, hot hush of the summer morning, every irrelevant sound and scent seemed magnified. The quick thudding of her heart, like a drumbeat, the slight, rough rustling of the magnolia leaves, the far-off, plaintive sound of a swamp bird, and the sweet smell of the flowers outside the window. She had killed a man, she who took care never to be in at the kill on the hunt, she who could not bear the squealing of a hog at slaughter, or the squeak of a rabbit in a snare. Murder, she thought dully. I've done murder. Oh, this can't be happening. Her eyes went to the stubby, hairy hand on the floor, so close to the sewing box, and suddenly she was vitally alive again, vitally glad with a cold, tigerish joy. She could have ground her heel into the gaping wound which had been his nose and taken sweet pleasure in the feel of his warm blood on her bare feet. She had struck a blow of revenge for Tara and for Ellen. There were hurried, stumbling steps in the upper hall, a pause and then more steps, weak, dragging steps now punctuated by metallic clankings. A sense of time and reality came back to her. Scarlett looked up and saw Melanie at the banister, clad only in the ragged chemise which served her as a nightgown, her weak arm weighed down with Charles' saber. Melanie's eyes took in the scene below in its entirety, the sprawling blue-clad body in the red pool, the sewing box beside him, Scarlett barefooted and gray-faced, clutching the long pistol. In silence, her eyes met Scarlett's. There was a glow of grim pride in her usually gentle face, approbation and a fierce joy in her smile that equaled the fiery tumult in Scarlett's own bosom. Why, she's like me, Scarlett thought. She understands how I feel, and she would have done the same thing. With a thrill, she looked up at the frail, swaying girl, for whom she had never had any feelings but of dislike and contempt. Now, struggling against hatred for Ashley's wife, there surged a feeling of admiration and comradeship. So, I love that scene for many reasons, not just because she wants to put her heels in the warm blood, but because this is such a pivotal moment in the story. It changes how Scarlett looks at Melanie. And for anyone, I think, who is going to write about crime, and if you're going to write about it in a serious way, I think it's important to realize that crime is actually a tool in the plot. You know, it's a way to talk about human nature. It should always change something. It shouldn't just be there because it's exciting and it's fun to write about the hole where his nose used to be and that sort of thing. It should change something in the characters. It should say something about the characters. And that's why that scene to me resonates so much even today. Because, as you know, if you're familiar with the story, what Melanie says to her not is, "You've killed a man, oh my God, what are we going to do?" She says, "We need to bury the body." And then she says, "We need to check his pockets because he could have money and we need money." And that's something that crime also does. It really gets to the base level of need in a human being. And you see that as they have to dispose of the body and they go through hiding the fact from their family that this is the thing they had to do, and suddenly we have a little money. Well, that's just, that's from God. That's a wonderful thing. They don't really talk about what they've done, and it's a secret they share. And if you're writing about characters, the most important thing you can ever do with a character is have a secret. And if it's a secret only the reader knows, to me that's really a gift to the reader, because I love showing something when I'm talking about someone like Will Trent, who's one of my characters. You know, the reader knows a hell of a lot more about him than even he does, about his past, a little bit about his future. And that's something that I think, as a rhetorical device, sort of pulls the reader in and makes them want to know more about this character and think that the character is a real person. Because probably we know people in our own lives, and we know some things about them that they're not really cognizant of themselves. So for me, I really like to read that passage, not only because I think it's a beautiful passage, but being a Southerner, I think it's really important to get that out. And I am from the South. I love being from the South. I love the fact that we're such a great region of this country. We've given, the South has given Martin Luther King, Jimmy Carter. We'll take Bill Clinton. We won't take George Bush. If you talk to any person who lives in the real South, Texas is not the South. Texas is Texas. So I like talking about this when I travel around. You know, one of the things that I think I benefited from the most is that there's a great tradition in the South of storytelling. And I remember when I was a very little girl that my father was always telling us stories. I'm the youngest of 3 girls, so this was the way he kind of kept us from beating the crap out of each other on long rides, you know, when you're in the back seat and the only air conditioning is the windows are down and your skin is sticking to the vinyl seats. And as the youngest, I was always in the middle. And my sisters would say, "Oh, she breathed on me, she touched me, she looked at the cow that's on my side of the road." And, you know, my dad, it was my side. And my dad would tell us stories about people. And when I was younger, they had a cautionary tale attached, like the little girl who left open the refrigerator door and died. Or the little girl who touched the thermostat and died. But when my grandmother passed away, she, as all slaughters were, she was buried in the Sodom Cemetery in Covington. And my father would take us every Easter to go see her, because my grandmother loved Easter. That was her favorite holiday. And I remember very clearly, I think probably women here who are like girls who have fathers who will really engage in them might recognize that a lot of times the way that some men relate to their daughters is to scare the crap out of them. And we were lucky because my friend down the street, Allison, her father thought it was hilarious to put a ladder outside her window and put a sheet on his head in October. And she's still in therapy for that. But when we would go visit my grandmother, there was a preacher who was buried in the Sodom Cemetery. And this is kind of a common thing in the South. This guy, you know, he loved Jesus, and he was buried with a telephone. And there was a cord that went out the grave to a telephone pole. And, you know, in retrospect, it seems kind of weird if he thinks that there's going to be a resurrection, that God won't go that extra mile and take him out of a grave. But he wanted to be able to call people if it happened and tell them, you know, hey, it's Jimmy, come get me. And I guess this is sort of like the same logic that Harry Potter is the most powerful magician in the world, but he can't, like, cure his eyesight, he needs glasses. But the preacher was buried here, and my grandmother was here, and the parking lot was here. And rather than go straight, my dad would make us go by the preacher's grave, and we would go under the telephone pole, you know, in that line. And one time, it was, you know, me and my two sisters, and my dad had a bell behind his back, and he rang it, and we thought it was the phone. And we ended up, I don't know how we got there, but in the back seat of the car, covered in urine. And so we are still in therapy for that. But that's, you know, those are the sorts of things I grew up with, is just being completely terrified. And of course, as soon as I got old enough, I wanted to scare people too. And I would do things like hide under the bed and grab my sister's leg when she was trying to get in bed, which is why every time I go to bed at night, still, all these years later, I look under the bed because I'm scared my sister is going to be there somehow. Even here in New York, I looked under the bed. But my grandmother was a very important part of our lives when I was growing up, and she passed away when I was 8, but I remember her very clearly because she was so important to my father. She had 9 kids. She was very poor. Her husband was such a bad person and such an alcoholic that he got kicked out of the Klan for not taking care of his family. That's a true story. And he, you know, he ran moonshine, and he was just any kind of stereotype you can think of. That was my grandfather. And my grandmother had to, despite him, find a way to raise these kids. And they squatted in houses, and when they would have to move, when the owner found out they were there, and they'd get kicked out, they would take the floorboards with them so they wouldn't have to sleep on the dirt. And this is the kind of life my father had growing up. And when he became a successful person, you know, he's a real American success story. He became a used car salesman. Don't hold it against him. He had to do something. But he really wanted to do something for his mother. And when I was a kid, I was really conscious of this desire my dad had to make her life easy and make our lives easy. And so one summer, my grandmother finally had a house, and my dad helped her pay for it. She finally got away from my grandfather, and she was living there, and there was a big hole in her roof because the house was not a great house, and she really couldn't afford to take care of it. And we lived a little distance from her, and so my dad decided he was going to replace the roof. And so my grandmother came to live with us for 2 weeks, and my parents divorced shortly after that. I'm not sure there's a connection. But when everything was done, my father took her home, and we had no idea why he had this huge grin on his face. And I'm sure that he knew if he told us what he'd really done, that we would probably tell my grandmother, because we're horrible at keeping secrets. And we went to the house, and you know, my dad had put new shingles on the roof, and my grandmother said, well, they're not green like the old ones, and my dad said, because there aren't trees growing out of them. And we went into the house, and my dad said, Mama, I want to show you something that I did for you. And he took her to the shed porch, and he had put a bathroom in the house, and she never had that. She always had the outhouse, and there was always a roll of toilet paper and some Hornet spray in there. And she had running water at the sink in the kitchen, but it wasn't hot water. And she would never let her family do anything for her. She would say, save your money for yourself, I can get by. But my dad put this bathroom in for her. And I remember my grandmother looked at the toilet, and she looked at my dad, and she said, I am not going to do that in my house. And on her deathbed, she literally crawled to the outhouse, past that toilet. And when we would go in there, she would come in with a bottle of Clorox and a rag right after us, because she just thought that was the most disgusting thing in the world. And it is, when you think about it. You know, and another thing that my grandmother gave me, I think she really fostered an early interest in crime and people having secrets. You know, she would take me to church and she would introduce me to everybody. She'd say, this is Mrs. Smith, this is Mrs. Jones, and as soon as a woman turned her back, she would say, well, you know she's a drinker. Or, you know, her husband's cheating on her. Or, you know, she always had something, and Lord forbid you got into her business. That was rude. But she knew about everybody else's business. And so that's something that I think is in my work. I always think of characters in terms of what their secrets are. And I love crime fiction. I think it's fantastic. I think you would be hard-pressed to name 5 books that are seminal books in the American canon that don't have some kind of crime, whether it's The Great Gatsby, Gone with the Wind, which has a bloody murder. I mean, the list goes on. And my grandmother read this magazine, maybe some older people will remember it, called True Crime Magazine. It was basically snuff porn. There was a woman on the cover, and she was looking, you know, and looking over her shoulder, and the headline said she should have listened to her husband, or her father was right, you know. And inside it was some cautionary tale about how this woman went to the store when her husband told her not to, and she was butchered, or, you know, raped and, you know, cannibalized, or some, all this sort of horrible stuff. It was really awful. And it was so awful they didn't have it at the local grocery store at our Kroger. And so every Sunday my grandmother would go before church to the Piggly Wiggly on the bad side of town, and she would get this magazine, and then she would take it home and put it under her chest of drawers, and then she would go to church because she didn't want it in the parking lot. And then at church, you know, she'd do her thing, and then she would go home and she would start the Sunday dinner, and while that was cooking, she would read True Crime Magazine, and then when she knew we were coming, she put it back under the chest of drawers because she didn't want us to see it. And of course, the first thing we did when we got there was we would go to her bedroom and look under her chest of drawers, and then we would read it and we would wet ourselves. There's like a lot of urine involved in my childhood. And so one Christmas I thought, hey, let's do something great for Grandma. Let's give her a subscription to True Crime Magazine. And my parents, well, first they were shocked because usually I wanted to get her stuff like toys that I wanted. And so they said, okay, well, we'll do that. And Christmas morning, my parents were really cruel because they made us eat breakfast before we opened our gifts. And so we were at breakfast and I couldn't wait. I said, Grandma, you'll never guess what we got you. We got you a subscription to True Crime Magazine. And she burst into tears and she said, I do not want the postman to know I read that. And my father spent the day after Christmas on the phone with True Crime Magazine canceling the subscription, and they charged him to cancel it. So I'm thinking this is some kind of racket they had going back then. But that's, you know, that gives you some insight into my work, I think. Extremely ungrateful people, other people trying to please them, and lots of murder and fear and urine, a little urine thrown in, let's be honest. That's going to be my next book, is urine. But I love writing about these people that I'm familiar with. And I also grew up in Atlanta during a time of the Atlanta child murders. So I'm very aware of what crime or the threat of crime can do to the community. That's something I think all crime writers should remember, is the crimes you are writing about, with the exception of some paranormal experiences with vampires, maybe paranormal, that could be paranormal, yeah, but vampires and stuff, right? They're not real, right? You have to be aware that these crimes happen to people every single day. I mean, just in the course of this conversation, something bad has happened to a lot of people, just in America, not counting the rest of the world, just in America. 250,000 women are raped every year. We don't hear about them unless they're murdered. We normally only see them in the news if they're white, middle class, and pretty. Probably we only news the whole week if they were pregnant at the time. It's just something that's not talked about, but crime fiction talks about it. And I think that's another important component of crime fiction, is it always talks about what is happening in society. And I think there's an immediacy to the work, because normally we're writing a book a year. So we're really tuned in to what's going on. And I remember when there was this spate of memoirs about women writing about child abuse and that sort of thing. And some of them, like Bastard Out of Carolina or Mary Carr, I mean, they were fantastic memoirs. But I always thought crime fiction has been doing this for a really long time. We've been talking about domestic violence. We've been talking about how crime changes communities. And to me, that's what our job is when we write about those types of books. And I know many of you want to be writers in here. I would honestly discourage you from doing that. There's very little chance you'll be successful. The odds are against you. I had my agent do the math, because obviously as a writer I'm not very mathematically inclined. But there's around 350,000 books published every year in America. That's real books, not self-published. That's what's out there. I guess you could say, on the bestseller list, if you just do 1 through 10 on the New York Times, probably 400 slots are available. So that's less than a 1% chance that you will be in the top 10 of the New York Times list. So if you are going to try to be a writer, I would urge you to define what success is going to be for you. If it's Gone Girl, Gillian Flynn didn't know that was going to happen. If it's The Help, it sat for 3 or 4 months before it took off. And, Kitty Stockett was just as surprised as everybody else when that took off. The books that are the big books are not the ones generally that publishers plan to be big books. They're books that people in-house really love, that touch a moment in time with people. And you really just can't anticipate that. You can look at all the tweets in the world and you can't really tell what sort of thing people are looking to read next. So you need to write the book that you want to read. And your readers too. That's why you want to be writers, is because you started out reading and you thought, hey, I can do that. I want to tell stories too. And if you define success as, I'm going to write the best book I can write, and hopefully someone outside of my family will read it, then you're going to really be aces up. If you say, I'm going to be the next Dan Brown didn't know he was going to be the next Dan Brown. Nobody does. Publishers are not your enemy. They're your advocate. I know that it's really trendy right now to talk about how irrelevant publishers are, but you really do need them. You need editorial advice. And when you get to a certain point in your career as a writer, you can basically say, I'm not going to be edited. You can name those writers for me, I'm sure. The ones who are listening to their editors, who are taking feedback, who are trying to be writers, are the ones who are very successful for themselves. Because when I sit down to write a book, I'm not writing a book so that someone in Holland or Bulgaria will buy it and it will be a #1 in Poland. I'm writing it because I want to write this story. And if you lose touch with that, if you let the business of writing or the despair of not being published, which is a horrible, awful despair, get you down, then you've lost focus on why you're doing this. You're doing it because you love language, you love words, you love telling stories. And once you disconnect that person from the whole business of writing, that's, I think, when you can be successful. And every writer I know who is successful really enjoys writing, really enjoys telling stories. And you can tell when you read a book that someone really wanted to do it. And you can also tell when someone just did it for a paycheck. And you are a reader and you use your money to buy books, and you need to understand that when you get really pissed off when a writer delivers a crappy book and you've paid good money for it, don't do that to somebody else. Write the book that is the best book you can write. And when I look back at all the books I've written, I know that when I started that book, I said, I'm going to write the best book I can write. And then when I got to the next one, I said, this one has to be better than the last one. You have to keep improving. Writing is a muscle. And it's like every muscle, it needs to be exercised, and you need to keep reading. Stephen King is a prolific reader. Stephen King is one of the best writers we have in America today. No one can write characters like he can. I mean, you may not like the stories, but his characters stick with you. Everybody knows them. They're part of the national psyche. Whether it's the characters from Misery or The Stand or Carrie, or he is so good at crafting people you want to know more about. And they may be awful people. And for some reason you want to even know more about the awful people. Maybe more than the good people. I mean, that is a gift. That is a talent. And if you have that gift, then you need to make sure that you are honoring that, because most people do not. For most people, writing is painful. For most people, I mean, everybody wants to be a writer, let's be honest, especially if they have a child and they want to be a children's book writer. But, if you are chosen, if writing has chosen you, you have got to honor that, and you have got to make sure that you love every second of it, even the hard parts, even the painful parts. And like I said, every author I know who is a successful author does that. I think the best advice I ever got, believe it or not, was from Harlan Coben. And he said the problems you have when you're successful are better than the problems you have when you're not. And that's so true, because, you know, it sweetens everything. But if you lose touch with that person who was in the library or was in first grade or whenever, just picking up your first book and reading, you know, Rebecca or Nancy Drew or Encyclopedia Brown or Sarah Paretsky or Judy Blume, and thinking, oh, I'm getting goosebumps from the story, I want to do that. That's the person you are. And if that person still gets goosebumps when they think about writing, then you're successful. Even if you never publish a book, you're successful. So I would hope that all of you would take that home.